January 1943. A winter wind crawls through the streets of Lyon, slipping between shuttered cafes and the darkened windows of occupied France. Snow gathers on the iron railings, melting slowly under the faint orange glow of blackout lamps. Footsteps echo in a narrow alley, steady, deliberate, almost too calm for a city living under German command. A man walks alone. His coat is worn, his collar pulled high. The brim of his hat hides most of his face, but not his expression, composed, unreadable, almost cold. He carries no weapon. Only a folded document in his gloved hand, edges softened from hours of nervous handling. Up ahead, a Gestapo checkpoint waits beneath a stone archway. Two officers smoke in silence, their breath turning into brief clouds in the freezing air. One of them hears the approaching steps and turns, eyes sharp, hand drifting toward the flap of his holster. The man speaks first. A flawless Berlin accent. Crisp. Clipped. Authoritative. The officers straighten and step aside, barely glancing at his papers. He passes between them without a tremor. No one notices the faint exhale of relief leaving his chest because no one knows the truth. The accent they respect is not his own. And this night is only the beginning of how he slipped inside the Gestapo's walls. In the first years of the German occupation of Western Europe, power did not simply rest with the armies that patrolled the streets. It rested with fear, a carefully engineered presence built through surveillance, interrogation, and the quiet disappearance of anyone who stood in the way of the Reich. At the center of this machinery stood the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, founded in 1933 and expanded relentlessly as the war deepened. By 1943, it had become the most feared security organ in occupied Europe, a force that prided itself on detecting dissent before dissent even found its voice. France, once vibrant and divided only by politics, now lived under a suffocating dual reality. In the north, a military occupation governed daily life. In the south, the Vichy regime collaborated with Berlin, allowing German security services to operate with near-total freedom. Cities such as Lyon, Paris, Dijon and Bordeaux became hubs for arrests, deportations and intelligence gathering. The Gestapo field offices in these regions pulled information from informants, intercepted communications, and dismantled resistance networks with surgical brutality. Yet resistance grew anyway. Young couriers carried messages across borders. Radios transmitted coded signals from attics and barns. Saboteurs struck rail lines and factories tied to the German war effort. The response from Berlin was predictable. Increase infiltration efforts, broaden surveillance, and penetrate the very heart of the resistance through deceit, bargaining, and psychological pressure. It became a war fought not only with rifles but with forged documents, accents, uniforms, and carefully crafted identities. Into this shadowed arena stepped a man whose name would later surface in scattered archives and testimonies, a multilingual operative whose background intersected with the currents of pre-war Europe. Born in a region marked by shifting borders and overlapping cultures, he learned early how language could be both a tool and a shield. His native tongue differed from the German he would later master, yet he studied it with such intensity that even native Berliners found no fault in his cadence. It was a skill he polished long before anyone imagined how valuable it would become. By the early 1940s, he had already drawn the attention of networks connected to British and Free French intelligence. His facility with languages, his ability to mimic regional accents, and his calm under pressure made him a rare candidate for deep infiltration. He was not loud, not flamboyant, not inclined to seek recognition. What set him apart was something quieter, a composure that made lies sound natural and truth sound unremarkable. It was precisely the kind of demeanor useful for a man expected to move through the most dangerous rooms in Europe. At this stage of the war, the Gestapo's internal structure offered both risk and opportunity. While its leadership remained centralized, its field offices depended on rapidly trained local collaborators, clerks, translators, and administrative aides. Occupied territories required men who could blend in, speak the language, and handle paperwork. Some were Germans sent from Berlin. Others were locals seeking protection, influence, or survival. That mixture created a complex operating environment, one where an outsider with the right identity could slip in if his documents were good enough and his behavior never raised even the faintest suspicion. Intelligence leaders understood the stakes. An agent who could work within Gestapo offices, even for a single month, could rewrite the balance of power in a region. He could access arrest lists, planned raids, courier routes under surveillance, all the names of double agents already compromised. He might even identify the informants whose whispered rumors had undone entire resistance groups. The possibilities were enormous, but so were the risks. If caught, there would be no trial, no negotiation, no prisoner exchange. The Gestapo did not extend mercy to those who dared impersonate them. Still, he accepted the assignment. The path to infiltration began not with daring action, but with painstaking preparation. He studied files on German administrative culture, the tone used in internal memos, the formats of reports, the correct way to initial a page or reference a directive issued from Berlin. He learned regiment numbers, regional chains of command, and the habits of German officers posted to France. It was not enough to sound German, he had to think in the rhythms of their bureaucracy. Meanwhile, in cities like Lyon, the Gestapo strengthened its grip. The headquarters on Place Bellecourt became a place ordinary citizens avoided even glancing at. Foot patrols grew more aggressive. Raids became more frequent. Every week brought rumors of new arrests, new deportations, new betrayals. Fear pressed down on the population like another winter coat, heavy and inescapable. It was into this tightening world that the agent stepped, building the identity he would soon present at a Gestapo office door, an identity that would allow him to walk openly among those everyone else feared. And as the German apparatus expanded, the final stage of preparation drew near, opening the door to the next phase, the construction of the disguise that would carry him straight into the heart of the secret police. The months leading to his infiltration unfolded with the quiet precision of a craftsman shaping the final details of a dangerous creation. Every part of his assumed identity had to withstand scrutiny, not just at a checkpoint, but under the eyes of officers trained to detect hesitation, inconsistency, and fear. In 1943, the Gestapo was no longer the inexperienced organization it had been a decade earlier. Its officers had interrogated thousands, torn apart resistance groups, and learned to read the smallest signals of deceit. An infiltrator would survive only if he offered them nothing to question. His forged documents began with a Ken cart, the internal identity card that governed movement across occupied Europe. From there came the Arbeitserlaubnis, the travel permissions, the service records, and finally, the most dangerous paper of all, a letter of authorization placing him as an administrative attaché temporarily reassigned from a unit in Germany. The story positioned him as a minor but educated bureaucrat, someone whose presence would not raise curiosity, but whose role granted access to file rooms, internal memos, and daily correspondence. The cover required more than ink and paper. He needed plausible knowledge of the office he was allegedly transferred from, its ranking officers, its typical procedures, even the tone used in its communications. Intelligence handlers supplied him with fragments collected through intercepts, captured mail, and testimonies from defectors. He assembled these fragments into a coherent memory, repeating them until they felt like pieces of his own past. The training extended beyond documents. He worked on posture, gestures, and the subtle behaviors expected of German officials. He studied how officers held their cigarettes, how they adjusted their belts, how they responded to subordinates. Gestapo personnel often blended arrogance with discipline. Mistakes were rarely forgiven. He learned to replicate this balance, never appearing timid, never appearing boastful, always efficient, always controlled. Meanwhile, the city chosen for his insertion, Lyon, one of the most contested intelligence battlegrounds in France, grew increasingly hostile for resistance work. The Germans considered the region strategically vital. Rail lines, industrial transport hubs, and strong networks of local fighters. Moreover, the presence of skilled German officers, including the rising figure Klaus Barbie, intensified the danger. Barbie's methods were direct, ruthless, and unpredictable. His office recorded interrogations at all hours. Entire districts felt his presence. The agent's handlers understood this environment well. They also understood that the very intensity of German security in Lyon created opportunities. The Gestapo offices needed clerical reinforcement. They needed German-speaking personnel for translation and for processing the relentless flood of reports. A new transfer arriving from Germany, especially one with the right paperwork and confidence, could slip into place without fanfare. Still, the insertion demanded cautious timing. He was introduced into the region not with drama but with silence. He travelled in stages, avoiding major border crossings, always maintaining the persona of a civil servant on official movement. The clothes he wore, pressed, conservative, appropriate for a lower-ranking administrator, were chosen carefully. Even the luggage he carried matched the profile. Light, functional, nothing extravagant. Throughout the journey, he rehearsed key moments in his mind. The first checkpoint. The first conversation. The first time he would walk through the doors of a Gestapo building, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes trained by habit to detect anomalies. He understood that the margin for error was no more than a heartbeat. When he arrived in Lyon, the city felt both familiar and transformed. He knew its neighborhoods, its post-war charm, its old theaters and riverside markets, but now everything was muted under occupation. Posters in German lined the streets. French police patrolled beside German units. Curfews were strict. Even the sound of footsteps after dark carried a different meaning. The location chosen for his infiltration was the Gestapo sub-office responsible for administrative coordination, a building where reports from field agents and local informants were processed before being escalated to higher command. It was not the central interrogation site, but a nerve point for the flow of intelligence. Exactly the kind of environment where an infiltrator could gather information quietly. His first day was set. His papers were ready. His accent was flawless. His posture matched that of a man who had spent years inside German bureaucratic walls. All that remained was to walk into an office feared by thousands and be welcomed as one of their own. And with that entry point prepared, the deeper layers of this story unfold through the angles that shaped both the man and the operation he was about to undertake. Infiltration is often described in terms of technique, planning, and courage. But at its core, it is an intimate, personal disassembly, the slow removal of one's own identity to make room for another. For the agent entering the Gestapo, the transformation went beyond language or posture. It required stepping into the psychological space of the enemy, adopting their worldview long enough to appear authentic while resisting the corrosive effect that such immersion could bring. He understood that one false gesture could expose him. Every morning, as he prepared to step into the office, he had to lower his natural instincts, the instinct to help, to warn, to recoil when he heard the heavy boots of officers who had tortured friends of the resistance. Instead, he had to maintain the steady, emotionless demeanor expected of a functionary serving the Reich. That meant silence when he overheard arrests being planned. That meant nodding whenever colleagues discussed interrogations, sometimes with a casual tone that unsettled even hardened soldiers. It meant accepting that his inner reactions could never reach his face. Emotional control became his greatest weapon, the shield that allowed him to remain invisible in the most dangerous environment imaginable. There was a specific loneliness in this role. He could not confide in anyone. He could not show hesitation or warmth. Even his sleep became fragmented, not because he feared dying, but because he feared slipping, even for a moment, into being himself. To survive, he had to remain the person his forged documents said he was. And in that transformation, a deeper cost accumulated, one that would follow him long after the mission ended. Tide world, the Gestapo appeared monolithic, all-seeing, and omnipresent. But like any bureaucracy, it had rhythms and weak points. For an infiltrator, understanding those internal rhythms was essential. The agent's role gave him access not to top-secret directives, but to the arteries through which information flowed. Every morning brought stacks of reports. Notes from informants, surveillance logs, courier route predictions, and sometimes crude sketches of suspected meeting points. He could not simply look at everything. Doing so would draw attention. Instead, he learned to extract intelligence in the small windows available to him. A misplaced stamp. A carbon copy left in a drawer. A memo waiting in a typewriter carriage. His mission was not to steal single documents but to build patterns. Which districts were being watched most heavily? Which resistance figures had been identified? Which operations were nearing compromise? He memorized details with the speed of a man who knew he might never see the same paper twice. Some nights, under the guise of organizing files, he shifted folders just enough to glimpse the contents beneath. Other times, he volunteered for mundane tasks, sorting, cataloging, transcribing, because these offered opportunities to filter what information mattered. Crucially, he also learned how the officers thought. Their priorities. Their assumptions. Their blind spots. The Gestapo prized efficiency but suffered from overconfidence. Many believed the resistance was already fractured beyond repair. This arrogance left gaps, and he exploited them quietly, consistently. Through this slow accumulation, he became a silent observer inside the machine. Every detail he extracted allowed the resistance outside the building to breathe another day. In the 1940s, the tools of espionage were simple by modern standards: typewriters, carbon paper, rubber stamps, coded telegrams, wax seals. But in the world of clandestine operations, these low-tech instruments determined life or death. The agent's forged identity relied on a deep understanding of these materials, not as props, but as authentic components, indistinguishable from the originals. Forgers, working with Allied intelligence, had studied German documentation meticulously. They understood the weight of the cardstock used for Kennkarten, the exact shade of ink preferred by Gestapo officers, the typeface of internal forms, the pressure needed to create a convincing stamp impression. In some cases, stamps were carved by hand from stolen examples. In others, they were replicated through photographs smuggled across borders. But even perfect documents could betray their owner if the underlying story lacked coherence. A birth date that didn't match the implied age. A unit assignment inconsistent with known deployment records. A misspelling that suggested a foreign hand had crafted the file. The Gestapo audited papers frequently, sometimes aggressively, especially when new personnel arrived. The agent carried his forged papers, knowing that any discrepancy could unravel him instantly. He also understood that documents were just the beginning. The real test came in the small interactions. Signing his name without hesitation, referencing a regulation without pausing, recalling the details of his fabricated past as though he had lived it. Every day he survived validated the forgers who had risked their lives to create his identity. And with each successful interaction, the tension between the fragility of his disguise and the strength of his purpose grew sharper. Through these layers, human, tactical, and technological, the operation took shape, setting the stage for the remaining angles that reveal the forces pressing against him from all sides. To infiltrate any organization, one must understand it. To infiltrate the Gestapo, one had to understand not only procedures but psychology, the quiet rules governing how officers behaved when they were confident, suspicious, bored, or overworked. The agent studied these patterns constantly, because in this environment, danger rarely announced itself. It appeared instead in the way a senior officer tilted his head during a conversation, or how an interrogator's tone sharpened when reviewing paperwork. Gestapo culture was built on hierarchy, distrust, and rigid obedience. Officers did not question orders openly. They did not display uncertainty in public. They valued quick answers, decisive action, and visible loyalty. The agent mirrored these traits carefully, offering short responses, avoiding unnecessary questions, and completing assignments with structured efficiency. That behavior made him unremarkable, which was exactly what he needed to be. He also noticed something else. The Gestapo was divided internally. Some officers were ideologues. Others were careerists. A few were simply men trying to survive in a brutal system. These distinctions shaped how they treated each other, how they assessed threats, and how predictable they were. Ideologues, for example, interrogated documents with ferocity. Careerists avoided trouble and preferred clean paperwork. The agent used these tendencies to navigate the office, engaging with each officer according to the psychology that governed them. It was not admiration that allowed him to read them so well, it was necessity. To stay alive, he had to understand their world better than some of them understood themselves. Infiltration inside the Gestapo meant living in constant conflict between opportunity and restraint. The agent found himself daily surrounded by information that could save lives, names, locations, planned arrests, yet he could not act impulsively. Passing the wrong intelligence at the wrong time could expose him instantly. Failing to act could doom those he was trying to protect. He walked a narrow line where every decision carried weight far beyond the walls of the office. Some days, the information he saw was devastating. A courier's name flagged for surveillance. A safe house scheduled for a raid. A resistance cell compromised by an informant. The urge to intervene was immediate, burning, instinctive. But he forced himself to breathe, to assess, to wait. His priority was long-term penetration, lasting access to the enemy's plans. Acting too soon, too boldly, would shorten that access to mere hours. Instead, he developed a system of subtlety. Small, carefully timed alerts. Messages routed indirectly through layers of intermediaries. Occasional delays introduced into paperwork hours that could allow a resistance group to scatter before a patrol arrived. None of these actions were dramatic or traceable. They were barely visible disruptions in an ocean of bureaucracy. Yet sometimes the choice was harder. There were moments when he recognized a name he could not save, not without exposing everything. Those losses weighed heavily, becoming private burdens he carried in silence. They reminded him of the limits of human endurance within clandestine war, the reality that no infiltrator, however skilled, can protect everyone. This moral tension shaped the man as deeply as any training. It taught him that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it was defined by the quiet acceptance of impossible choices. While the agent moved unnoticed through the Gestapo's corridors, the resistance outside adjusted its strategy with newfound clarity. Reports from Lyon began to show patterns of avoidance arrests that failed by minutes, patrols that arrived to empty apartments, raids conducted on buildings long evacuated. German officers grew frustrated, attributing these failures to increased enemy discipline rather than recognizing the invisible hand disrupting them from within. The resistance operated in splintered units across the region, each following different methods, but united by the same purpose. Couriers traveled impossible distances under curfew. Organizers met in barns, cellars, and back rooms of cafes long after closing hours. The information the agents supplied filtered, cautious, precise, allowed these groups to reorganize more safely. Even a single warning about a compromised route could protect dozens of members. For commanders coordinating sabotage operations, the intelligence he provided shaped the timing of actions. Rail lines were hit hours before German reinforcements mobilized. Munitions depots were targeted exactly when guards were rotated. Arrest squads arrived to find only empty fields or abandoned vehicles. It was not luck, it was the ripple effect of an infiltrator who understood exactly how the enemy planned its moves. The Germans noticed the pattern but misinterpreted it. They suspected leaks among French collaborators, rival intelligence agencies, even internal sabotage. They did not imagine that the quiet man transcribing reports in their own office was feeding life into the very networks they were trying to crush. These converging angles, psychological, moral, and strategic, tightened the narrative around the agent, bringing him step by step toward the moment when the infiltration would reach its breaking point. By the spring of 1943, the infiltration had evolved from cautious observation to active disruption. The agent's position inside the Gestapo office granted him access to increasingly sensitive material enough to change the tempo of resistance activity across the region. But the deeper he moved into the workflow of the organization, the higher the risk became. Every new assignment, every unexpected request, carried the possibility of collapsing the fragile construct of his identity. The turning point began on a morning that seemed, at first, unremarkable. A senior officer arrived from the central headquarters carrying a briefcase sealed with red wax. He announced that Berlin had ordered a comprehensive audit of personnel and operations in Lyon, an investigation designed to uncover inefficiency, corruption, or infiltration. The word hung in the air like frost. Infiltration. It was not aimed at him specifically. Berlin had issued identical orders to other occupied cities. But for a man living behind forged papers, such an audit was as dangerous as a spotlight turned directly upon him. The officer distributed assignments. Every department would be examined, and every individual's background re-verified against central records. For most, this meant a tiresome week of paperwork. For him, it meant disaster. Still, he did not panic. Instead, he listened carefully, noting names, timelines, and the structure of the audit. It would begin with field officers, then interrogators, and finally, administrative personnel. That sequence bought him time, not much, but enough to act. That same afternoon, he was given a task he had long anticipated and dreaded: assisting with the reorganization of arrest files ahead of the audit. These files contained the names of hundreds of suspected resistance figures, upcoming surveillance targets, and dossiers scheduled for interrogation review. Access to them represented an immense intelligence opportunity. But it came with scrutiny. 2 officers supervised the room, and every folder removed from the cabinet had to be logged. He worked with methodical calm, his hands steady even as the weight of risk pressed against him. When an officer stepped out to retrieve a missing list, the room's tension shifted for a fleeting moment. He used those seconds to scan the upcoming raid schedules, cross-checking locations, dates, and names. One entry froze him. A planned mass arrest in the Quaraus district scheduled within 48 hours, targeting several safe houses linked to a major resistance organizer. The attack would be devastating. Hundreds lived in those buildings, many with no connection to the resistance. And once the raid began, the Gestapo would use it to conduct interrogations en masse, extracting new names and tearing apart networks all over Lyon. Preventing it was essential, but helping too quickly could expose the pattern that Berlin's audit was designed to detect. Later that evening, as he walked home under the muted glow of blackout lamps, the city felt heavier than usual. Patrols moved restlessly. Citizens hurried indoors before curfew. Even the river seemed motionless beneath the stone bridges. He understood that the coming 2 days would decide the fate of the infiltration and perhaps his life. The next morning, the tension inside the Gestapo office sharpened further. The visiting officer from headquarters had begun preliminary interviews, pulling staff into a private room one by one. Each conversation lasted roughly 20 minutes. Questions were direct, clipped, delivered with the authority of someone trained to detect hesitation. When the agent heard his name called, he felt the world narrow to a single corridor between him and the interrogation room. Inside, he maintained the persona he had built for months. He sat upright, hands visible, posture balanced. The officer read through his file, pausing occasionally. He questioned his unit transfer, his administrative experience, and the details of his previous assignments in Germany. The agent answered calmly, matching the confidence expected of a man with nothing to hide. He offered no unnecessary details, no embellishments, only the plausible minimalism of a functionary who believed in hierarchy and regulation. But then came a question that pierced the surface. Why was your previous evaluation not included with the transfer documents? It was a small gap one, created not by error, but by necessity. His forged identity had been built from available pieces. The missing evaluation was a void that could not be filled without attracting more attention. He responded with a measured explanation, a common administrative delay. Routine during the winter transports, supported by a reference to a genuine directive he had memorized. The officer studied his face, searching for a crack. After a long silence, he closed the file, dismissed him, and called the next name. The interview had ended. But the danger had not. Because that same afternoon, news circulated through the office that the audit team had requested additional verification from Berlin. Cross-checks of transfers. Confirmation of personnel movements. Clarification of administrative irregularities. If Berlin responded quickly, his forged past would come under direct scrutiny. He had hours. Maybe less. That night, the agent made the decision he had tried to avoid. He would intervene directly to stop the Krauhaus raid. Not subtly. Not gradually. He would prevent it outright, because by the time Berlin's verification arrived, he might no longer be inside the office to help anyone. And with that decision, the infiltration that had survived through precision and restraint entered the moments where everything would converge. While the Gestapo questioned whether Chapman's accent was fake, British intelligence grappled with a different problem entirely. Could they trust a man who had once robbed them blind? To many in MI5, Chapman was a walking headache. His past charges safe-cracking, impersonation, fraud read like a con artist's resume. He was brilliant. Yes. But controlled? Rarely. Loyal? Questionable. Stable? Debatable. Yet the more time they spent interrogating him, the more MI5 officers noticed something others had missed. Chapman possessed an instinctive understanding of people, how to disarm them, how to charm them, how to imitate them. He had the rare ability to become whatever the moment required. A clerk, a German sympathizer, a French tourist, a military courier. British handlers eventually realized something even more valuable. Chapman enjoyed the performance of deception. It was his stage. His oxygen. His craft. And if directed well, that craft could be turned into a weapon. But the risk was enormous. Giving a career criminal access to wartime intelligence was a gamble few were willing to take. There were heated arguments behind closed doors about whether claiming him from German custody was a terrible mistake. Still, MI5 kept coming back to the same conclusion. If they did not use Chapman, the Germans certainly would. And they would use him well. So, against their own instincts, they trained him. They taught him wireless protocol, sabotage strategy, cover maintenance, and dead drop procedure. They showed him how to lie convincingly under pressure, how to stay calm during interrogation, and how to mimic the operational habits of a committed Abwehr agent. But more importantly, MI5 gave him something he had never had before: purpose. Chapman embraced it with the same intensity he once reserved for smuggling rings and heists. Not because he suddenly became noble, but because the work rewarded his nature. It demanded cunning, nerve, improvisation, boldness, dangerous creativity. He was no longer merely fooling police or nightclub owners. Now he was fooling the Nazi intelligence machine, and that elevated the entire game. It was this alignment of skill and mission that set the stage for everything that followed and pushed Chapman into the most dangerous mask he would ever wear. And that mask would place him face to face with the very men hunting Allied spies across Europe. By the time Chapman formally entered Gestapo circles, he understood exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. The Gestapo was feared not for its strict procedure, but for its absence of it. Files could disappear. Evidence could be invented. Suspects could be tortured or spared based entirely on the mood of an officer that morning. The chaos made them powerful and predictable in ways they never realized. Chapman watched closely. He noticed the pride, the vanity, the obsession with appearing shrewd, superior, unstoppable. He let them believe they were smarter than him. He let them mispronounce English phrases while he corrected them just subtly enough to pass as helpful. He exaggerated his rough English background to justify the very accent they whispered about. Rural schooling, he would shrug. Not many books. Lots of fists. He made himself simple enough to underestimate, yet skilled enough to be valuable. Chapman learned which officers preferred cigarettes and which preferred praise. Who wanted detailed reports and who preferred to hear the mission is proceeding well. He discovered that one officer was particularly sensitive to being contradicted. So Chapman always agreed with him, pausing only to add a small detail that made the officer feel intelligent. Another officer wanted to be feared, so Chapman allowed himself to appear slightly nervous around him, but never incompetent. It was psychological tailoring, done with the precision of a surgeon and the warmth of a performer. He never allowed the Gestapo to become suspicious of his fluency or his composure. He scattered small imperfections through his behavior, misremembering a coded phrase here, asking for clarification there just enough to mimic the learning curve of a real British recruit. To them, Chapman was a useful asset. Honest, eager, slightly unsophisticated. Someone to send on missions, not someone to scrutinize. And in a building where false confidence killed, the fact that Chapman could slip beneath their radar was nothing short of extraordinary. Yet each passing week inside the Gestapo offered him another opportunity, another piece of intelligence he could one day feed back to the British. But for now, he had to immerse himself further. He needed to convince them he was worth deploying. That moment would come sooner than anyone expected. The German intelligence world of the early 1940s was not the monolith it pretended to be. It was fragmented, territorial, and riddled with rivalry. The Gestapo, Abwehr, and SD all fought over jurisdiction, resources, and prestige. Each believed it was the true guardian of the Reich. Each wanted to prove it captured better spies, ran better networks, and made fewer mistakes. This rivalry was not just political, it was personal. And it created the blind spot that Chapman walked straight through. When the Abwehr began to take interest in him, they saw something the Gestapo had missed: opportunity. Here was a man who knew safecracking, vehicle engines, radio gear, and English street culture. A perfect, multi-purpose agent. To the Abwehr, Chapman's accent wasn't suspicious, it was useful. A man who sounded rough would blend more naturally with certain working-class British environments. The Abwehr cultivated a reputation for being more professional than the Gestapo. More analytical. Less impulsive. But in practice, this attitude often made them overconfident, especially when dealing with someone they believed they had turned. Chapman benefited from every layer of this arrogance. He noticed the officers who wanted to prove their branch could train a superior infiltrator. He sensed the desire for an operation that would impress Berlin. He understood the pride invested in their training methods, their sabotage manuals, their ideological lectures. So he excelled, but not too much. Just enough to allow them to take credit for shaping him. Within weeks, they were discussing missions that would place Chapman back in Britain, missions requiring him to regain freedom of movement inside the very country now hunting Nazi agents. They imagined Chapman would return as theirs. But the truth was simpler. Every hour in their training rooms, every test, every briefing, every lecture only pushed him closer to the moment MI5 had been preparing for. Because to infiltrate the Gestapo was one thing. To be selected by the Abwehr as an elite agent and then betray them from within was another entirely. Chapman was now on the threshold of the mission that would define him. And that threshold leads directly into the moment where everything begins to accelerate and converge, the moment when the operation reaches its breaking point. Night settled over Hertfordshire like a heavy cloak, muffling the edges of the de Havilland aircraft factory. In 1943, the facility was more than a cluster of hangars and workshops. It was the heart of Britain's Mosquito production line, one of the fastest, lightest, most versatile aircraft of the war. Germany wanted it silent. Permanently. And the man they believed capable of doing it stood alone in the dark, with a suitcase of explosives he had no intention of using. Chapman paused near the fence line, cold air pressing against his face. The Germans had planned every step of his mission. The insertion, the objectives, the timing, the detonation sequence. They believed they had shaped him, trained him, owned him. What they did not know, could never know, was that Chapman had surrendered the moment he had landed in Britain. Every instruction, every coded message he now carried had already passed through MI5 quiet rooms in London. He was no longer walking into a sabotage mission. He was walking into a performance. And the success of that performance would determine whether the Abwehr continued to trust him, whether Germany continued to rely on his intelligence, and whether he lived to see the next sunrise. The real explosives were gone, removed by British handlers during the operation's preparation. In their place were harmless replicates designed to produce evidence, not destruction. Chapman's task was to act. To leave traces. To leave just enough physical signs for the Abwehr to applaud his accuracy, while never disrupting a single hour of British aircraft production. He moved through the shadows with the confidence of someone who had studied the factory's rhythms. Security patrols. Shift rotations. The subtle glow of windows where mosquitoes were assembled late into the night. These were details he learned not from German training, but from MI5 briefings conducted in small rooms, maps laid out between cups of tea. He stopped at the first location on an exterior wall near the wing assembly hall. It was a logical target. Visible. Critical. Exactly the sort of place a German saboteur would strike. He placed the mock device carefully, marking the wall with slight scorch powder MI5 technicians had formulated to leave convincing residue without flame. Then he moved to the second location, this time inside a maintenance shed where tools and solvents were stored. A real explosion here could have triggered a devastating chain reaction. But tonight, everything had been orchestrated to appear dangerous without being so. Chapman set the final device and stepped back, exhaling slowly. Every motion had to be believable. Every choice had to fit the mental image the Abwehr had of him: skilled, daring, precise. But in reality, the UK's war machine was still humming behind him, unaware that its survival rested on the craft of a man many considered untrustworthy. When the detonation moment passed silently, harmlessly, MI5 teams moved in, building the scene Germany expected to see in photographs and reports. Shattered glass was arranged by hand. Burn marks painted into existence. Scorched metal created with controlled chemical treatments. Even a section of roofing was deliberately bent by engineers to resemble blast damage. It was meticulous. Almost surgical. And yet, only a handful of men understood the true stakes. If Berlin doubted Chapman, if they sensed even a wrinkle in his report, the entire deception network could collapse. Dozens of other double agents depended on his credibility. MI5 double-cross system relied on the idea that Germany still believed Britain was incapable of turning high-value operatives. Chapman was the proof the Germans needed to confirm their false assumptions. And tonight, he was either going to reinforce that belief or shatter it. When Chapman walked into the MI5 safehouse afterward, he was calm, almost serene. He removed his jacket, lit a cigarette, and told his handlers how he planned to describe the operation in his radio transmissions. His plan balanced detail with imperfection. Too polished, and it would look rehearsed. Too sloppy, and it would appear fabricated. Chapman understood that deception required just enough chaos to feel real. Days passed. Berlin reviewed his transmitted report. They analyzed the photographs MI5 had staged. They evaluated the burn patterns, the supposed blast points, the damage to the facility structure. The Germans were expecting one of their most ambitious sabotage attempts to strike a blow against British aircraft production. What they concluded instead was something far more important for Chapman's survival. They believed him. The Abwehr praised the precision. The Gestapo praised the zeal. Berlin sent commendations. They even began discussing medals and future missions. For Chapman, this trust was not a reward. It was leverage. Power. A shield he could use to manipulate the intelligence stream that flowed back to Germany. And with each passing day, the deception grew deeper, binding Chapman more tightly to the role only he could play. Because the Germans were not simply pleased by the sabotage, they were excited. They wanted him to do it again. They wanted him closer, deeper, more entangled with their operations. Which meant the next phase of the mission would demand even more nerve. And that demand forms the threshold of the next decisive escalation. The success of the de Havilland deception did more than elevate Chapman in Abwehr reports. It altered his trajectory entirely. Within weeks, Berlin shifted from viewing him as a promising recruit to regarding him as a strategic asset. His handlers wrote that he possessed courage, technical ability, and ideological reliability. They believed he had proven his loyalty through sabotage, through risk, through the destruction of a factory they considered vital to Britain's aircraft output. But before Chapman could absorb the implications, the Germans assigned him a new role, one far more dangerous than the last. They wanted him back on the radio. Alone. Unsupervised. Deep behind British lines. Radio transmissions were the beating heart of the war's intelligence networks, and the Germans believed Chapman was now ready to feed them continuous battlefield insight. But operating a clandestine radio set inside the United Kingdom was a lethal undertaking. British detection teams' specially trained signal units could triangulate rogue transmissions in minutes. Any abnormal signal spike could bring security forces straight to the door of the operator. And Chapman would be transmitting deliberately. He sat in a safe house near London, the dim crackle of his German-supplied radio filling the room. MI5 officers stood silently against the wall, keeping out of sight. Chapman adjusted the dials, tapping out coded messages with the steady cadence of a man completely in control. He was telling Germany exactly what MI5 wanted them to hear: aircraft losses that never occurred, bomb damage that never happened, naval deployments that existed only on paper. A double agent's life is not shaped by action but by silence. The silence between transmissions. The silence as Germany interprets them. The silence as MI5 waits to see whether Berlin responds with trust or suspicion. Chapman's first false reports were carefully designed to blend truth with fiction. A destroyed warehouse here. Slight damage to a transport hub there. Minor details that kept his voice believable without handing Germany anything of value. The Abwehr, eager to maintain momentum after the de Havilland success, embraced every word. But with each transmission, the danger grew. MI5 detection teams understood the risk. Chapman's radio was German. Its frequency range, its signal strength, its harmonic signature even, its internal oscillator were identical to equipment used by genuine enemy agents. If a British radio monitoring station picked it up, the operator would have no reason to assume cooperation. They would act. Fast. Without hesitation. Chapman knew this. He knew that every key press could bring men storming through the safe house door. Weapons drawn, unaware they were about to arrest one of their own double agents. He sent the messages anyway. The tension intensified when Germany requested longer transmissions, more detail, more clarity, more operational depth. A longer transmission meant a longer signal window, and a longer signal window increased the chance of interception. Chapman delivered them regardless, never allowing his tone or rhythm to betray the fear any normal agent would have felt. Yet the real danger did not come from British detection teams. It came from Berlin. Within the Abwehr's headquarters, Chapman's reports were creating ripples. Each detail he sent strengthened his profile. Each deception he executed raised expectations. and those expectations carried a weight that even Chapman could not fully control. Soon, the Germans began pressing him for specifics. Could he penetrate ports? Could he monitor troop movements? Could he report on RAF activity? Could he approach sensitive industrial targets again? They wanted more. They wanted bolder assignments. They wanted to exploit the man they believed had struck a blow against de Havilland. And Chapman needed to keep them satisfied without giving them anything that would harm Britain. This delicate balance reached a breaking point in late 1943. Berlin, confident in his success, sent word that Chapman's contributions were exemplary. They elevated his status again. He was to prepare for expanded operations, possibly extending beyond sabotage into political subversion. They wanted him to assess morale, to study public reaction, to identify potential recruitment pools. But embedded within the praise was something far more dangerous. A request for Chapman to return to Germany. Not permanently. Not yet. But enough for debriefings, verification, new assignments, and further training. MI5 read the message with stone faces. A return to Germany meant interrogation, physical inspection, a re-evaluation of his ideological commitment. And the possibility, however, slim that someone would notice a detail out of place. A phrase, a recollection, a gesture that hinted too much at British influence. If Chapman went, the risk was incalculable. If he refused, the deception collapsed instantly. His handlers debated into the night. Chapman sat quietly, absorbing every word. He knew the weight of the moment. He knew that men in grey uniforms waited for him across the Channel, men who had once questioned whether his accent was real, and who would question much more now that he had tasted success. After hours of tense deliberation, the decision was made. He would go. But not as the man the Abwehr thought they had moulded. He would go as Britain's weapon, armed with a story, a cover, a purpose, and the nerve to face the very organisation whose suspicion could end everything in a single glance. This journey, more than any sabotage plot or radio transmission, would test Chapman's identity. Because crossing back into Germany meant stepping onto the stage where a single mistake could cost him his life. And that step leads directly into the consequences that reshape every side of the war's intelligence struggle. The moment Chapman agreed to return to Germany, his life entered a phase few double agents survived. Crossing back into the Reich meant stepping into a world where suspicion was a constant presence, quiet, subtle, patient. The Abwehr welcomed him warmly, but in wartime intelligence, warmth was often a mask. Every handshake hid an evaluation. Every smile concealed a test. Germany believed they were greeting a man who had crippled a British aircraft factory, dodged security patrols, and delivered flawless intelligence under pressure. To them, Chapman was proof that the Reich could mould even a British-born criminal into an instrument of sabotage. They treated him as a valuable operative, but valuable operatives were never trusted blindly. Chapman knew this. MI5 knew it. And the Abwehr, unknowingly, confirmed it within hours. He was placed in comfortable quarters, not a cell, but not freedom either. His belongings were inspected. His clothing examined. His pockets searched with the casual thoroughness of a gesture meant to unsettle. These checks were not about finding contraband. They were about gauging his reactions. Would he appear nervous? Defensive? Contradictory? Chapman gave them nothing. He remained calm, polite, respectful. His years of navigating police stations had conditioned him to this kind of scrutiny. The real test came during debriefings. Senior officers wanted a full account of the de Havilland sabotage. Every position he moved through. Every guard rotation he observed. Every decision he made in the darkness. They pressed for details, pressing harder each time they found consistency instead of cracks. Chapman narrated the mission exactly as MI5 prepared him to. He knew every inch of the staged damage. He could describe the scorch marks, the twisted metal, the broken glass. He spoke of the tension he felt, the sounds, the weight of the equipment. Small sensory textures filled his story, grounding it in a realism even German interrogators found convincing. And then came the photographs. The same photographs MI5 had edited and staged. The same photographs the Germans had praised. Now they placed them in front of him, waiting for a flicker of recognition or confusion. Chapman studied each image with measured control. He pointed out details he remembered. He agreed with the angles. He confirmed the timing. In intelligence work, the truth is rarely what someone says, it's how quickly they say it, how naturally, how automatically. Chapman passed every test. Not because he memorized answers, but because deception was his native language. He improvised with ease, reinforcing the narrative Berlin wanted to believe, that they had created a skilled and loyal operative. Satisfied though never fully trusting, the Abwehr advanced him to the next phase, celebration and ideological consolidation. Officers praised his contribution. They hinted at commendations. They described future missions that would require even deeper penetration into British infrastructure. Yet underneath the praise, Chapman sensed something else. An unease. A quiet awareness that winning German admiration was not freedom, it was entanglement. The more they trusted him, the more dangerous his position became. Still, Germany's enthusiasm worked in his favor. They awarded him the Iron Cross, a medal rarely given to non-Germans. It was symbolic, yes, but symbolism matters in intelligence. For Berlin, it confirmed his reliability. For MI5, it confirmed his value. For Chapman, it confirmed that the story he had built, the man he had constructed, was now strong enough to shield him from scrutiny. But with that medal came expectations. The Abwehr wanted more sabotage, more intelligence, more infiltration. They believed they had shaped an operative capable of influencing the course of the war, and they intended to use him aggressively. Chapman returned to Britain under the guise of another operation, carrying new instructions, new objectives, and deeper German confidence. But MI5 understood the meaning behind his safe arrival. It meant Berlin now depended on him in ways that could be strategically exploited. Chapman had not just fooled them, he had become central to their wartime intelligence picture. Which meant the next phase of the conflict would not be defined by sabotage or infiltration, but by something far more delicate. The battle for control over the flow of information, what Chapman would tell Germany, what MI5 would allow him to transmit, and how long the illusion could hold before one side sensed the truth. And that struggle sets the stage for the second half of the aftermath. Chapman's return to Britain under Starman orders marked a new phase in the intelligence war, one fought not with explosives or covert movements, but with information. For the first time, Berlin viewed him not merely as a saboteur, but as a long-term strategic source. They believed he could shape their understanding of British infrastructure, military readiness, public morale, and industrial capacity. It was an illusion MI5 intended to preserve carefully. Back in London, Chapman resumed his transmissions, this time with the weight of German confidence behind every coded phrase. But transmitting false intelligence was more complicated now. The Abwehr's expectations had grown. Their questions became more specific, their requests more ambitious. They wanted production figures, anti-aircraft positions, naval repair schedules, and shipping movements. They wanted insight into factories, ports, and RAF bases. And Chapman gave them all of it. Just not the truth. MI5 analysts constructed detailed fictional narratives for him, stories that blended minor truths with significant distortions. They fed Berlin inflated bombing successes, underestimated British aircraft output, and false indications that certain industrial sectors were struggling. To maintain credibility, they sprinkled in occasional British victories or operational resilience, just enough to keep the Germans from believing he was painting too bleak a picture. The brilliance of Chapman's transmissions lay in their texture. He didn't sound like a man reading prepared intelligence. He sounded like a man living inside the war-observant, improvisational, occasionally mistaken. These imperfections were intentional. He would misread a ship name. He would miscount a convoy. He would correct himself mid-message. Such human flaws gave the Abwehr exactly what they wanted: authenticity. But Chapman's growing influence carried consequences. His reports began indirectly shaping German operational planning. Some bombing raids were redirected toward targets his fictitious accounts described as vulnerable. Other raids were deprioritized after he claimed their previous damage had been catastrophic. It was deception with measurable impact. At one point, he reported that British civilian morale had been weakened in certain districts, an entirely invented detail. The Germans, believing the report, shifted propaganda broadcasts to exploit the fictional weakness. The results were non-existent, but Berlin attributed the failure not to faulty intelligence but to British resilience. The deeper Chapman embedded himself in their worldview, the more they relied on him to interpret that world. But the longer a double agent operates, the thinner the line becomes. One misphrased message, one contradiction, one careless omission could unravel the illusion instantly. Chapman lived under that pressure every day. MI5 monitored him closely, not because they distrusted him, but because they understood the fragility of the system surrounding him. In 1944, that fragility became unmistakable. As Allied preparations for D-Day intensified, the British intelligence community tightened control over all double agents. Chapman was already feeding Germany distorted accounts, but now, every fragment of information he transmitted had to fit into a wider deception. Strategy one that aimed to obscure the location and timing of the Allied invasion. Chapman played a supporting role in that framework, amplifying the notion that British defences in certain regions were weaker than they actually were. Germany listened. They interpreted. They adjusted plans. And Chapman watched as the tide of war shifted his role small but undeniably present within a vast network of calculated misdirection. By mid-1944, however, the role of double agents was changing. The Germans were losing territory, losing momentum, losing confidence in the very intelligence systems they once prized. Their communications became sporadic, delayed, unfocused. Chapman sensed it before many others did. The Reich was contracting, and with contraction came desperation. The Abwehr's messages grew shorter. Their requests lacked clarity. They praised him still, but the enthusiasm had faded. Chapman continued transmitting, but the responses no longer carried the same urgency. Berlin was beginning to understand, on some instinctive level, that the strategic picture they had relied on was crumbling. And as the war pushed toward its final year, the truth became unavoidable. Chapman had done his job too well. The deception web had grown too deep, too consistent, too airtight for Germany to unravel in time. They had built plans, real military plans around information he helped shape. And by the time the Reich realized the scale of the collapse, there was no possibility of reversing it. It was in those final months that Chapman's role, once central to Germany's hopes, became a ghost. He transmitted less. Berlin responded less. And eventually, the connection faded into silence. But silence, in this case, was not a failure. It was confirmation. The intelligence war had ended for Chapman, not with a dramatic confrontation or a final coded message, but with the quiet dissolution of the system he had infiltrated. Which brings us to the final step of this journey: what Chapman's story means, not just for wartime intelligence, but for the strange, unstable boundaries between criminality, loyalty, deception, and survival. Night had settled over the quiet outskirts of Hertfordshire, but Eddie Chapman felt none of its calm. The cold bit through his coat as he crouched behind a row of stacked timber just beyond the de Havilland perimeter fence. The factories sat in silence, dark hulks against the cloudy sky, waiting for the spectacle he was about to stage. Behind him, two MI5 technicians knelt over a box of equipment. They worked without speaking, their hands quick and sure, even in the dim light. A false explosive charge. A timed flash unit. Enough scorch marks to satisfy a German intelligence officer. Nothing that would so much as scratch a window. One of the technicians whispered, 2 minutes, Mr. Chapman. After that, it's your performance. Chapman nodded, though the gesture felt stiff. A hardened safecracker, ex-convict, thief, yet tonight his hands trembled more than they ever had in a jeweler's shop. Because this time, the loot he was stealing was truth itself. Selling a lie to people who killed for sport. He slipped through the cut section of fencing. The compound air smelled of oil, metal, and winter damp. Every step echoed too loudly. Every shadow felt like a patrol. He forced his breathing into slow, controlled rhythm, the same rhythm he'd used cracking safes in the blackout nights before the war. The technicians placed the imitation charge at the base of a warehouse wall, then retreated, leaving Chapman alone. This was his moment. He set the flash trigger. Checked the placement of the phony timing device. Looked up at the silent roofs and imagined Luftwaffe officers leaning over maps, imagining his triumph for the Reich. His pulse pounded. If they sniffed out a lie, they wouldn't just kill him. They'd take their time. He stepped back and lit the fuse, a harmless, theatrical line that would burn toward the flash detonator hidden just out of sight. A sizzle. A hiss. The faint smell of burning cordite substitute. Chapman moved fast, retreating through the shadows toward the fence. He counted steps, counted breaths, counted seconds. When he hit 27, the night erupted. A sharp white flash burst behind him, lighting the factory yard like a star had exploded. A thunderous crack followed, loud enough to sound convincing from a distance, soft enough to avoid breaking glass. Chapman didn't look back. Theatrics worked best when the performer never flinched. He slipped out of the fence just as MI5 handlers pulled the cut section close behind him. One of them clapped his shoulder. If the Germans believe this, the rest of the war gets a little easier. Chapman exhaled, but only a fraction of the tension left his body. Tomorrow, he'd be on a plane to Lisbon, then Paris. Then to Berlin's Lion's Den, where men in leather coats and cold eyes would demand proof. And he would smile, steady and calm, and take credit for a bombing that never happened. But tonight, just for a moment, he let the silence of Hertfordshire wrap around him. The lie was planted. And the deadliest part of his mission had only just begun. The air in the interrogation chamber felt colder than the Berlin winter outside. Concrete walls. A single lamp suspended from a cord. A table scarred by previous conversations that never ended well for the man sitting opposite. Eddie Chapman took his seat. Across from him, Oberstleutnant Stefan von Gruner, an Abwehr officer with a face carved from stone, opened a folder thick with reports. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, predatory. A man who measured lies for a living. Gruner began without greeting. Herr Chapman, you say you destroyed the de Havilland facility. A statement, not a question. Chapman met his gaze. Calm on the surface. Ice underneath. Yes, Oberstleutnant. Thoroughly. Gruner slid a photograph across the table. Aerial reconnaissance. Faint scorch marks. No structural damage. A view carefully staged for this very moment. This is modest. Chapman leaned in, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. It looks modest because your pilots photographed the wrong section. The charge was placed internally where it would cripple the wing assembly line. A calculated lie built from MI5 careful coaching. Gruner studied him, eyes narrowing with the precision of a blade sliding into a sheath. He reached into the folder and produced another sheet. British reports intercepted last week indicate the factory has increased production. Chapman didn't blink. Increased inspection, not production. They're terrified of sabotage now. Every mechanic is supervised. Every shift is doubled. Gruner's jaw tightened. That had the ring of operational truth. But he wasn't finished. He leaned back, hands clasped. Friends in Paris, tell me you are a criminal. A thief. A man of flexible loyalties. Chapman allowed a slow smile. That's exactly why I'm valuable. A patriot dies for his country. I work for whoever offers me the better future. It was the line MI5 had told him never to use. And it was exactly the one that earned Gruner's interest. The Abwehr man steepled his fingers. And the Reich is your better future. Here it was the pivot on which survival balanced. Chapman held his gaze, refusing the urge to swallow or shift in his chair. For now. Silence pooled in the room like oil. Gruner finally nodded a tiny cold gesture. Very well. We will verify your results. If they are confirmed. He closed the folder. You will be rewarded. Chapman didn't need the last line spoken aloud. If not confirmed, you will disappear into a basement, and no one will hear you again. 2 guards escorted him out. His legs felt steady, but only because they'd learned long ago how to walk, while his heart hammered like a detonator. As the door shut behind him, he allowed one thought to surface. The Germans believed the lie for now. But the next test would be worse. Much worse. And he would have to survive it with nothing but nerve, luck, and the thinnest layer of truth he could weaponize. The train slid into Berlin-Anhalter-Bahnhof just after dawn, brakes hissing through the cold. Smoke drifted across the platforms, mingling with the distant growl of military trucks and the clipped rhythm of boots on concrete. Germany was tightening, hardening, preparing for a war it could no longer fully control. And into that tightening net walked Eddie Chapman, a British double agent, welcomed as a German hero. He stepped down from the carriage wearing a tailored coat the Abwehr had provided, polished shoes, and the forged identity that granted him more access than many German officers. Yet every stitch of the disguise felt like a fuse waiting to catch fire. Waiting for him on the platform was the man who had vouched for his loyalty, Oberstleutnant von Gruner. The same cold, restrained figure from the interrogation chamber. Now, however, there was a faint approval in his eyes. Chapman had passed the first test, and that alone made him valuable. Herr Chapman, Gruner said, extending a gloved hand. Berlin appreciates results. Come. You will be briefed shortly. 2 uniformed escorts fell in behind them. A privilege. And a warning. Chapman was driven through the center of a city at war with the world and increasingly at war with itself. Blackout curtains hung in every window. Anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward like skeletal fingers. Propaganda posters covered the walls, promising victory with a confidence the population no longer fully believed. Berlin smelled of coal, cold iron, and fatigue. Inside the Abwehr headquarters, Chapman was led down quiet corridors where typewriters clacked like distant gunfire. Officers passed with folders pressed to their chests, eyes hollowed by months of bad news from Stalingrad and the Atlantic. Germany needed miracles now, and the men in this building had been trained to distrust them. Chapman was taken into a private office where a map of Britain dominated the wall. Pins marked airfields, ports, and research facilities. Lines traced bomber routes. Circles denoted suspected intelligence centers. Gruner motioned for Chapman to sit. You have convinced us, Gruner said. His voice was calm, but the room felt charged. Your method at de Havilland was imaginative, effective. We believe you can serve the Reich further. Chapman kept his breathing steady. The factory he had destroyed was running at full capacity. His lie had held, but only because MI5 had supported it flawlessly. Gruner placed a new folder on the desk. We want you to return to Britain, he said. This time with long-term objectives. Chapman didn't move. Objectives such as? Gruner opened the folder. Inside was a small photograph, a section of coastline, a radar installation perched on the cliff. Chain home radar, Gruner said. The British rely on it. You will sabotage a station of our choosing. Chapman felt a cold current ripple through him. Sabotaging radar? MI5 would not only expect him to return, they would need to stage another false attack. Bigger, cleaner, technically accurate. But Gruner wasn't finished. He slid another photograph forward. This one showed a shipyard. You may also be required to assist in interrupting coastal defenses. Mines, torpedoes, detonators. Your talents are versatile. Chapman knew what that meant. The Germans wanted him to weaken Britain's shoreline for U-boat operations. Any failure, any inconsistency would expose him. Gruner leaned back. Berlin believes you can become our most valuable man in England. A statement heavy enough to crush anyone who took it at face value. Chapman nodded slowly. If I return, he said, I'll need resources, equipment, and freedom to choose methods that won't compromise my cover. Gruner allowed a thin smile. He appreciated boldness as long as it remained useful. You will have everything you require. And then he said the line that made Chapman's pulse stutter, just for a moment. We have also arranged insurance. He nodded to the guards. One stepped forward and placed a small steel object on the desk. A detonator. German-made. Compact. Deadly. Carry this with you into Britain, Gruner said. For a specialized assignment. The details will follow. A detonator. If MI5 discovered it, the entire deception network would collapse. If he refused it, the Germans would sense weakness instantly. Chapman reached out and took the device with steady fingers. A thief's hand, a spy's nerve, and a man walking the razor edge between two enemy intelligence empires. Gruner clasped his hands behind his back. Prepare yourself, Herr Chapman. You depart soon, and this time, we expect proof even stronger than before. Chapman stood. Inside, he felt the weight of every lie he'd told since entering the German orbit. But outside, he wore the expression Berlin needed to see. Confidence. Control. Conviction. As he left the office and descended the long staircase to the street, he understood what this moment truly meant. The Germans weren't just trusting him. They were investing in him. And MI5, watching from a distance through the invisible threads of their operation, would now have to match the Germans move for move or lose him to the darkness he'd walked so deep into. The stakes had never been higher. And Chapman's next step would lead him straight into the most dangerous chapter of his double life. By the time Chapman slipped back into Britain under the thin veil of his German assignment, the war had tilted into a new and desperate phase. The Allies were gaining strength. Germany was bleeding territory. And yet, in the quiet rooms where intelligence officers measured victory in whispers, hesitation and coded cables, one truth had become unmistakable. Eddie Chapman had reshaped the expectations of two nations. He arrived at the MI5's safe house exhausted, thinner than before, carrying the detonator the Germans had forced on him. His coat still smelled faintly of Berlin coal smoke and the sterile scent of Abwehr offices. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the men assigned to receive him, veterans of deception, accustomed to agents walking in from enemy territory, regarded him with unusual stillness. There were not many who returned alive from the center of Berlin's intelligence machinery. Fewer still returned trusted by the enemy. And almost none returned carrying a device that could have exposed the entire double-cross system if mishandled by a single careless gesture. Chapman placed the detonator on the table. A simple object. Cold metal. A fist-sized reminder of Germany's faith in him and of their willingness to sacrifice him the instant that trust faltered. MI5 officers studied it silently. It was both a trophy and a warning. Then Chapman told them everything. The interrogation, the Berlin briefing, the radar plans, the promised assignments, the expectations that now sat on his shoulders like weights freshly forged. And as the details spread across the room, a second truth took shape, quieter but heavier. Britain now held the responsibility of sustaining a deception that Germany was ready to verify with force, analytics, and suspicion. The FO sabotage at de Havilland had succeeded beyond its intended scope. It had done more than convince the Germans of Chapman's value. It had convinced them that Britain's industrial backbone was vulnerable, that their agents could reach inside it and cut a vital artery. The German High Command had begun quietly recalibrating expectations based on this single belief. Production estimates, aircraft deployment schedules, even the projected attrition of British fighters. A lie had become a strategic variable, and Chapman was now expected to produce more. But deception had its own form of gravity. Every success required escalation. Every staged explosion demanded a larger illusion next time. MI5 understood this dangerous momentum too well. If they declined to fabricate the radar sabotage, the Germans would sense inconsistency. If they overplayed the deception, they risked disrupting Allied operations with their own false narrative. Chapman's value was becoming a liability as much as an asset. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the effects of his earlier actions continued to ripple. Abwehr analysts filed optimistic reports describing a British factory crippled by one man with specialized explosives. Production charts were redrawn. Air raid planners recalculated the potential gains of sustained sabotage. Chapman's fictional attack became an internal justification for future expectations. The propaganda branch, though never explicitly informed of the Chapman operation, benefited indirectly. The existence of a capable agent on British soil strengthened their internal morale briefs documents, circulated to officers insisting that German intelligence was infiltrating deep into the enemy homeland. It wasn't true, but it felt true. And in wartime, perception had the power to shape strategy. Then there was the Abwehr's own standing. In 1943, the intelligence service was under immense pressure from competing agencies, the SD, the Gestapo, and the tightening ideological machinery of the SS. Every misstep could be fatal. Every failure could be interpreted as betrayal or incompetence. Chapman's supposed success gave them something rare, a victory. A story they could hold up to their superiors as proof that the Abwehr was still capable of meaningful, high-impact intelligence operations. His existence was political currency in a system where careers and lives were lost in shadowy bureaucratic corridors. But this benefit carried its own risk. The moment Chapman failed to produce another victory, the Abwehr would not simply be disappointed. They would be endangered. And Chapman, alone at the center of these pressures, carried the weight of two nations' expectations, one believing him an asset, the other knowing him to be a weapon pointed in the opposite direction. MI5 officers understood this. And as they prepared the next deception, a simulation designed to satisfy Berlin's hunger for proof, they also recognized what Chapman himself had not yet admitted. If the lie grew too large or too perfect, there would come a moment when it could no longer be maintained. And that moment was drawing closer than anyone in the room dared to say aloud. The war was moving. Time was shortening. And Chapman's next step would determine whether the double-cross system continued its quiet successes or collapsed under the weight of its own brilliance. The consequences would reach far beyond one man, and they were only beginning to unfold. The weeks after Chapman's return unfolded with a tension that even seasoned MI5 officers felt deep in their bones. Britain was preparing for the decisive phase of the war. Germany was tightening its search for certainty as defeat in the East loomed closer. And between these two shifting forces stood a single agent whose lies now carried the weight of operational doctrine on both sides. Chapman resumed his role as a man moving silently between worlds. During the day, he lived under MI5 supervision. At night, he prepared the reports he would send back to the Abwehr, coded phrases crafted to keep Berlin confident, yet not emboldened to launch new, destructive initiatives. His task was no longer just deception. It was calibration. He had to give the Germans enough substance to maintain their belief in him, but not enough to compromise Allied operations or encourage misguided German strategic decisions. It was a razor-thin line, and even MI5 understood how precarious it was becoming. Still, the Germans were waiting. Chapman had been given clear assignments: sabotage a radar station, gather intelligence on British coastal defences, and provide technical insights that could help Germany disrupt Allied operations. To satisfy these expectations, MI5 staged controlled illusions, a carefully orchestrated ballet of false damage reports, altered photographs, and misleading agent communications. The first deception involved the Chain Home radar station. MI5 arranged a minor, controlled explosion on a non-critical structure outside the operational perimeter enough to create scorch marks, debris scatter, and photographic evidence without disrupting the functioning of Britain's early warning system. It was a delicate undertaking. Too much damage would weaken air defense sectors at a critical moment. Too little would appear implausible. The next morning, Chapman transmitted a report to his Abwehr handler. Precise, technical, measured. He described the sabotage exactly as MI5 had scripted it. Placement of charges, timing, structural impact, and the subsequent confusion among British engineers. Berlin received the message with interest and cautious optimism. Their analysts compared the details with aerial reconnaissance and found no immediate contradictions. For a moment, it seemed the illusion would hold. But the war was changing. Germany's intelligence network was fraying. Many of their agents in Britain had been captured or turned. Their methods were becoming more desperate, more analytical, more demanding. The Abwehr began requesting deeper insights from Chapman, information that MI5 could not easily fabricate without risking British military preparedness. One request struck at the centre of the problem: provide details of Allied preparations for large-scale coastal operations or landings. It was 1944. D-Day was on the horizon. The Allies were constructing the greatest deception operation in military history, Operation Bodyguard. MI5 now faced an unprecedented dilemma. They could use Chapman to feed Berlin selected, controlled misinformation consistent with Bodyguard. Doing so would enhance the overall deception plan, reinforce German misperceptions about the timing and location of the invasion, and maintain Chapman's credibility. But they also knew the danger. If Chapman's reports overlapped too closely with Bodyguard, the Germans might begin piecing together patterns revealing the scale of Allied deception. If his reports contradicted Bodyguard in the slightest way, the risk was equally great. Chapman was a powerful but unstable instrument. In the end, MI5 made a decision grounded in cold strategy. Chapman had reached the limit of his usefulness. His value had peaked. Any further involvement risked creating interference with the broader deception operations now underway for D-Day. And in intelligence work, when an asset becomes too unpredictable or too capable of disrupting parallel operations, the responsible choice is to close the file. Quietly, without ceremony, MI5 began preparing the end of his double life. Chapman's final report to the Abwehr was crafted with careful vagueness, just enough to maintain his legend, but without providing actionable or disruptive intelligence. Shortly afterward, communications ceased. The Germans, overwhelmed by failures and internal power struggles, lacked the clarity to tracking effectively. By late 1944, Chapman's role in the war was effectively finished. He would never return to Berlin. Never again sit across from an Abwehr officer measuring his heartbeat through silence. Never again balance the expectations of two empires on a single forged signature. His deception had run its course, and the war had moved into a phase where armies, not individuals, would decide its future. But the legacy he left, the one MI5 recorded in their internal files and the Abwehr unknowingly validated through their own trust, remained significant. He had secured one of the most successful episodes in the double-cross system. He had manipulated German intelligence at a moment when they desperately needed clarity. And he had forced the Reich to adjust strategies, reports, and expectations based on a sabotage that had never truly occurred. In a war defined by tanks, bombers, and armies, Chapman fought with hesitation, persuasion, illusion, and the human ability to perform courage so convincingly that even those who wished him dead chose instead to believe. What followed next was not dramatic, not cinematic, but deeply human. Chapman walked away from the shadows and returned to a country that would never fully understand the contours of his contribution. MI5 closed his file. Berlin lost track of its most capable agent in England, and the war thundered forward toward its final convulsions without him. But the deception he crafted, the lie that became a strategic truth, had already done its work, and history would remember that moment where reality bent, just slightly, around the choices of one unpredictable man. When war ends, its loudest echoes often belong to the machines, the armies, the grand strategies that carve their place into continents. But beneath those sweeping movements lie the quieter details, the human calculations, the small acts of courage or chance that push history in directions no general could fully predict. Eddie Chapman belonged to that quieter category. He was not a soldier in formation, not a statesman, not a man shaped for heroism. He came from the edges of society, a safecracker, a drifter, a man whose life before the war moved in the shadows for entirely different reasons. Yet when Europe collapsed into conflict, the very qualities that once defined his crimes became the tools Britain used to reshape a fragment of the battlefield. That is the strange gravity of war. It repurposes people. Chapman's story is not about loyalty in the traditional sense. It is about adaptability, the ability to survive between two empires by understanding their expectations more clearly than they understood themselves. He navigated deception with an instinct sharpened long before intelligence officers ever handed him a coded message. And for a brief moment, the fate of two nations' confidence rested on the shoulders of a man who was never supposed to matter. What he accomplished was not measured in destroyed targets or captured documents. It was measured in trust, the kind he gained from the Abwehr, the kind MI5 placed in his unpredictability, and the strange balance he maintained between them. His lies reshaped German expectations, protected British industries, and strengthened a deception web that influenced the direction of the war. But Chapman's life also raises a quieter question. What becomes of a man once the lies are no longer needed? For most agents, the end is anonymity. Silence. A return to a world that cannot understand what was done in its name. And in Chapman's case, history remembers him not as a hero, nor as a villain, but as a reminder that war sometimes depends on people who stand in the spaces between. Not perfect, not noble, simply necessary. And perhaps that is the truest measure of his legacy.